Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to today's Open Topography webinar. Today, I'll be discussing topographic differencing using OpenTopography's tools, and my name is Chelsea Scott. So today, we are in about the middle of our Open Topography webinar series. Here's the outline or the title of each of our previous webinars, and so today we are here, and then next week I invite you to join us where we'll be talking about hydrology using OpenTopography's tools. And of course, as always, if you are unable to join us or you would like to review past webinars, I invite you to go to our YouTube page where you can find the recordings of all of these webinars. And so just briefly, some logistics for today. So we are in a Zoom webinar and only the presenter and moderator will be able to speak. And we invite you to use the Q&A option to ask questions. If you ask questions during the presentation, then the other OT team members will likely be able to answer your question, and then we'll hold longer, more discussion-based questions for after the presentation, where you'll generally have another opportunity to ask questions. So here's the agenda for today's presentation. I'll begin with an introduction and background material to vertical and 3D topographic differencing. I'll then discuss an automatic, what we call on-demand topographic differencing tool in OpenTopography. And then I'll discuss some errors that are important to be aware of when you are analyzing the topographic differencing results. And then I'll discuss our recent project conducting statewide topographic differencing for the full state of Indiana. So to begin with, I'll discuss vertical topographic differencing. And so in this case, we often begin with topographic point clouds that were acquired at two different time periods. So here we see the first point cloud that's shown in blue can be called the pre-point cloud, pre-event, or sometimes in differencing lingo can be called the compare. The second point cloud, so post-event, can also be called reference. And so here we take that first or compare or pre-cloud and we grid that to a raster grid, which is shown here. Then we take the reference point cloud and we'll grid that point cloud to the same grid. So it has to have the identical boundaries and resolution. And so here you'll see that the reference or post point cloud, which is in pink, has a lot more points than the blue one. And one of the considerations for topographic differencing is that the later data set often has a higher resolution as well as a lower error. So it's important to keep these different data characteristics in mind when doing differencing. So once we have those two gridded data sets, the next step is to do a raster subtraction. And so in this case, the difference is calculated by taking the reference and then subtracting the compare data set. And so example results might look like this. And in all of the differencing results that I'll show today, we've used the convention that blue is up. So this may represent deposition along the fluvial system, and then red is down, and this could represent erosion. And then one option for looking at differencing is to do a sort of error calculation. So one approach to doing error is to mask out points where differences are below a threshold. So this generally is called thresholding. And here in this plot, points with an error that is too high are masked out. And so we essentially don't see or don't interpret the differences from those points. The other approach of differencing that I'll discuss today is called 3D topographic differencing. These are results of 3D differencing for the 2016 magnitude 7 Kumamoto earthquake in Japan. And in this case, the differencing results show these arrows, and that represents the vertical displacement, or the arrows represent the horizontal displacement, and they have these pink arrow ellipses. And then the colors represent the vertical displacements. And so this approach is, I think, very cool and very powerful, because with topography data, you can essentially get very high resolution 3D differencing. And this essentially looks like we have many dense network of GPS stations that cover this earthquake, when in fact only have high resolution topography acquired before and after the earthquake. So here's a slide that shows how the differencing works. The 3D differencing uses an algorithm called the iterative closest point, and it's applied to windows of the pre and post event topography data. So in this case, we take windowed subsets of pre and post event topography data, which are shown here in the red and the blue. And the size of the window determines the resolution of the differencing results, and it's often a few tens of meters. Then the iterative closest point algorithm is used to align the two sets of point clouds. And in this case, we see that blue point cloud is moved closer and closer to the red point cloud until it is aligned quite well with it. An important power of the iterative closest point algorithm is that both data sets don't have to be with the exact same coordinates. And so this can work, for example, if we have one data set that has 1 point per meter squared and another data set with 5 points per meter squared. Below this shows the equation for the alignment that's done in the 3D differencing. So we take the undeformed point cloud, apply a rotation, and then a translation, and this generates the deformed point cloud. In this case, there's no shearing or volume change in the differencing calculation. So the past few years at OpenTopography, we've been working on and have added an on-demand topographic differencing tool. So what is this? So the idea is that with just a few mouse clicks, users can run vertical and 3D topographic differencing on data sets that are hosted by OpenTopography. So it's a very powerful approach that democratizes access to differencing. So for example, both experts and beginners can come and use our tool to quickly generate differencing results. We've also worked to standardize the differencing approach, and I'll explain some of that work in today's presentation. Developing this differencing tool, we faced several challenges. First, we had to develop a system that could work well with legacy, so older, as well as hybrid data. Hybrid would include differencing of LiDAR with structure for motion data. Second, the algorithms have to work on demand. So this means that they must work essentially 100% of the time with very little input from the user. And for the algorithms to work efficiently, they must work well with OpenTopography's cyber infrastructure and HPC systems. So slide is looking at opportunities for differencing on OpenTopography. So you can perform topographic differencing on most overlapping red data sets. These red data sets are formally data sets that are hosted by OpenTopography. So this includes over 160 data sets, mostly located in the US and in New Zealand. If you're interested in using this, for example, for educational tools, there's lots of potential because these tools record a variety of geologic and anthropogenic processes. And we are working on implementing this differencing, vertical differencing for the USGS and NOAA data sets. So these are in blue and green, and this tool will soon be available for educational and academic communities. So I'll now do a differencing demo on OpenTopography. So I'll show you how you can use OpenTopography to do topographic differencing. And I'd prefer that you just follow along today, and then after the webinar, feel free to experiment with this tool. So you can all hopefully see my internet screen. Good.
Yeah, looks good, Chelsea.
All right, so here we are on OpenTopography's homepage, as you've seen many times during this webinar series. So to do differencing, you'll start like you normally do if you're interested in processing any data set. So you'll come here to data. And then today for this tutorial, we're going to be looking at differencing of a data set in southern New Mexico. So we'll zoom in here to New Mexico. And this is looking at the White Sands National Monument, where there's these 3 overlapping high resolution topography data sets. So then here we see those 3 data sets listed. They all span a dune field. And then over here, you see that there's this differencing toolbar. So whenever you see this toolbar, that indicates that there's some available differencing on that data set. So for today, let's select this January 2009, and we'll do click differencing here. So then that sends us to this page that tells us the options for topographic differencing. And so with this point cloud data set, we have 2 options. The first is vertical differencing. In this case, we're going to start with the point cloud data set. And so to do this, you'll want to press this button for start differencing. So that will then take you to this page where you have the option to set several parameters for your differencing calculation. So the first thing you'll need to do is to put a bounding box or a region where you'd like to perform differencing. So I'll just select an area in the middle of these 2 data sets. And this would be sufficient to start differencing, but I'll walk you through some of the other options that you can select. So here in this first toolbox, you have the option of selecting which data set you would like to difference. And so we have the 2 options of this 2010 data set or this other 2009. So I'll keep it at this 2010 data set. Can switch which data sets are called reference or compare, and this will essentially flip the sign of your differencing results. Here you can select the coordinates, or you can enter the coordinates of your processing, although we can just keep the box that we selected earlier. If the point cloud has been classified, you can do differencing with just ground points, for example, and have a differenced digital terrain model. And then 4 here we have is this error threshold. And so we can do this thresholding calculation where all errors below 0.5 meter will be masked out. In other words, those errors are lower than, or the displacements are lower than the significance level. And then finally here, you have the option of submitting a job title. We can call it dunes, vertical differencing, and then you can keep your email entered, so you'll get an email notification when the results have finished. So then we can press submit. And the computers at the San Diego Supercomputer Center have now turned on, and they are doing this vertical topographic differencing calculation for us. So keep that window up. And then I'm now going to go back and do that 3D differencing calculation. So again, we go to data. We're going to go to New Mexico and find the sand dune data set again. Select differencing. Again, we see we're presented with the vertical differencing option as well as the 3D differencing. And it's very similar to before, so we'll put a box over the area that we're interested in processing. And we'll use the default options for the processing. So we can then press submit. And now the San Diego Supercomputer Center is working on this 3D differencing calculation for us. And so here are the differencing results. These are results that I ran yesterday, although over a similar area. And so here's the vertical differencing results. So this ran in 120 seconds. So this took 2 minutes to process just under 20 million points. So the processing is very fast. You can download the original point cloud data sets or the vertical differencing data sets to review in any GIS software. And then here is a map of the differencing results. And so here we can see the dune field differencing. And so in this case, as I explained before, blue represents increase in height and red represents a decrease in height. And so we see this propagation of the sand dunes from the southwest to the northeast. And then if we scroll down more, we can see the topographic hillshades from both of these point cloud data sets. And again, the shape of these dunes is consistent with that movement towards the northeast. So those are the vertical differencing results. Now we're going to look at the 3D differencing results. Again, here the results run from yesterday for a similar area. The differencing took about 11 minutes. So again, it's still pretty fast. And here are the 3D results, where you can see these arrows represent the movement of the sand dunes over time. And again, we see that movement towards the northeast, which is consistent with both the shape of the sand dunes and the vertical differencing results that we saw. So that is the end of the demo on how to use OpenTopography for topographic differencing. I'll return back to the presentation. Here's a summary of those results that we just saw. So with the vertical and 3D topographic differencing tool, you can present the results that you see here. So again, we see the topographic hillshade over the sand dunes, the vertical differencing, which shows growth of the dunes towards the northeast, and then the 3D differencing results, which shows the arrows that represent the horizontal motion, and again, show this motion towards the northeast. So now discuss several considerations that you might want to make when doing topographic differencing. we often get the question of, should I do vertical or 3D topographic differencing? So generally, I recommend always starting with vertical differencing. First, most change that we want to see is vertical. So this can include the examples that you see here of erosion and deposition along rivers, coastal processes, earthquakes, landslides, cliff collapse, volcanic eruptions, urban growth, and changes to forest. So all of these processes have important vertical changes to the deformation field. And the vertical differencing also provides an opportunity to look at potential errors in the differencing results that may not be as clear in the 3D differencing. And I'll discuss some of those errors shortly. And the 3D differencing is really a niched differencing tool that should be applied only when you're quite certain that the landscape has shifted laterally. So examples include tectonic fault motion, for example, from an earthquake or a creeping fault, a creeping landslide, and sand dune migration. And of course, one of the benefits of the OpenTopography tool is that it is easy for you to experiment with the vertical and 3D topographic differencing tools and see which tool can best capture the change and the process that you're looking at. One of the considerations that we had to make for the 3D differencing was looking at the resolution. And so the resolution is the size of the window that we select from for the 3D differencing. So it's essentially what's the width of these blue and red boxes that you see here on the right. And so if we select too small of a box, then the problem is that the displacements will be too noisy, and we may not be able to capture the process that we're interested in observing. Alternatively, the box could be too big, in which case we can measure the deformation, which is good, but we may miss finer scale signals that could be resolved with our data set. So we did some synthetic testing to work to optimize the data set resolution for topographic differencing. And so we took a bunch of data sets and synthetically thinned them and offset them and calculated what the best window size was to get errors under an input threshold. And so in these results are shown here. These plots show window size versus point density for all points and for ground classified points. And we see this approximate exponentially decaying relationship for the ideal window size, where once we have about 1.5 or 2 points per square meter, the ideal window size is about 40 meters. If we have lower resolution point cloud data sets, then it can be advantageous to use a larger window size. Second, we showed that the window size for point clouds with just ground classified points can in fact be smaller. And this indicates that the vegetation, which often changes between the 2 point cloud acquisitions, is in fact largely just noise that makes it more challenging to align the 2 point clouds. So in the differencing workflow in OpenTopography, we make a recommendation of the ideal window size, and that's based on this relationship of differencing with the full point cloud data set. I will now discuss several of the errors that are common in topographic differencing. You can find a longer discussion of these 4 types of errors on a recent blog post on OpenTopography's page. And some of these motivation for this blog post came from questions based from our community about how to interpret these differencing results. So one of the most common types of errors in differencing results are topographically correlated change that reflects georeferencing errors. So in this schematic example on the left, see we have the 2-point cloud data sets, the pre shown in red, the post shown in blue. And in this case, they've been shifted, but that shift doesn't represent real landscape change. It just represents a georeferencing error. So in other words, the 2-point clouds are not well aligned with each other. And then when we do topographic differencing of these data, we get the line here shown in black. And so to the left, we get apparent subsidence, and to the right, we get apparent uplift. And this sign of the deformation correlates with the slope of the topography. And so this example is quite clear often to see, because you do have this correlation with topography throughout the full differencing results. Here's an example of how this error can look in real data. This is looking at the Susquehanna Critical Zone Observatory in Pennsylvania, where we see that across this ridgeline, the sign of the topographic changes from blue here on the southeast to red on the northwest. And this type of signal is very characteristic with this topographically correlated error. Another very common error that you will see are stripes in the topographic differencing results. And these represent georeferencing errors on adjacent LiDAR flight lines. And they create apparent vertical offsets that manifest as these linear swath-to-swath artifacts. So in this case, we see, looking here at a river in Indiana, and here are these two data sets. And then on the right, you see the vertical change. And these alignment errors are seen as these north-south oriented differencing stripes. And so these stripes that go through the data set are very, very unlikely to represent true vertical change of the landscape. And these flight alignment errors are often on the order of a few tens of centimeters or sometimes less. And they interfere most with interpreting smaller scale signals or changes that are often linear. So in this case, along the river system, our changes are true vertical changes are harder to interpret because the amplitude of change from this fluvial system is relatively low. Another type of common error in differencing is when you have an incorrect vertical datum. So these show an example of differencing on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. We're looking at differencing between data sets collected in 2006 and 2007. And the vertical differencing results show changes on the scale of a few tens of meters. And when you have this systematic change, that's a few tens of meters over your entire data set. And in that case, you're often differencing data in elliptical and orthometric heights. And it's very important to realize that the vertical coordinate reference systems can be misreported in the metadata. And so even if they both say they are in the same coordinate system, but you get this tens of meters change, you immediately need to be skeptical that the metadata associated with one or both of your data sets has been misreported. And the final error that I'll discuss today is missing or inconsistent point cloud classification. So this example is looking near Seattle. And in this case, here we have a 2004 data set, and then a 2018 data set. We attempt to do the differencing. However, the 2004 data set is only a bare earth data, so it doesn't contain any buildings or any vegetation. So when we do the topographic differencing, we are essentially getting a normalized digital surface model or canopy height model, but not anything that represents real vertical change of the Earth's landscape. And so generally, if you are interested in doing differencing of the digital surface models, it's important to start with 2 full point cloud data sets. If you're doing the digital terrain model, it's important to verify that the ground points have been classified correctly. And if not, you're likely to get the impact of vegetation in the differencing results. So we are now going to change topic, and I will discuss a project that OpenTopography has been working on over the past few years. And this is looking at statewide topographic differencing over the full state of Indiana. And this paper summarizing this work was published last year in the Journal of Remote Sensing. So in this project where we did statewide differencing of Indiana, we had 2 major motivations. First, we are interested in what it takes on a computational side to conduct this large-scale topographic differencing. And second, more on the scientific side, we're interested in what does a decade of change look like across a full state. And we're particularly interested in Indiana due to the variety of change in the state. So why Indiana? First, and most importantly, there were 2 LiDAR statewide data sets. And second, as I said a few seconds ago, there's multiple examples of interesting change that we were anticipating due to the urban, agricultural, coastal environments of Indiana. And third, OpenTopography has been in a decade or so long data hosting partnership with the state of Indiana. We are interested in growing this partnership. So we encountered many challenges during this project. First was due to big data. So for example, Indiana is about 2 to 3 orders of magnitude larger than the area of past large differencing studies. So we had to figure out how to effectively difference these over this large spatial scale. There are several challenges that we faced on the computation side. First, we needed to figure out how to use and optimize high-performance computing resources. Second, we had to figure out how to effectively meet the memory demands for this project. And the hardest part was resolving the point cloud to raster or grid computation. And then finally, the final products are about 4 terabytes in size. We needed to figure out how to store these data sets well and make them easy to access. We also considered noise. So what are the prominent sources of noise for differencing at the state scale? And then second, should we correct noise at the state scale? Is it important for this type of project? And what sort of effort would be required to do it? And then we were interested in what's the best way to visualize the results and to be able to share the results with a broad community. So here's the statewide differencing results for Indiana. On the left, you see the differenced digital terrain model, and on the right, you see the differenced digital surface model. And so at the state scale, there's several prominent differencing signals. One of the most prominent are from fluvial and riparian processes, and that can be seen here in the digital surface model, where we see the signals, differencing signals associated with several major rivers that cross the state. For example, the Wabash River and the White River. There's lots of signals associated with vegetation. For example, signals due to the season of the LiDAR acquisitions. Here you see this sharp change from purple to red, and this change represents different seasons of data acquisitions. Other signals from quarries and mining. So for example, these fairly small spatial scale, at least at the state scale, but high amplitude changes along the southern and western part of the state represent quarries and mining. And then in the digital terrain model, probably the most prominent signal are these north-south and east-west linear features. And these are these flight alignment errors that are in fact largely due to the earlier data set that went into the topographic differencing. So now we'll go over and go through some interesting examples of topographic change in Indiana. These first set of examples are looking at construction in Indianapolis. So this top example is looking at the building of a new suburban housing development, where each of these blue squares shows upward motion and represents the construction of a new house between the two sets of LiDAR data. This example in the bottom shows the development or the addition of this cloverleaf highway in a different suburb of Indianapolis. And so we see here some of this positive and negative change associated with this new part of the highway. And interestingly, also some of this bending of the roadway away from this new intersection. I think the most interesting geologic example of differencing are from sinkholes. So these sinkholes create this pimpled landscape in parts of Indiana. And with topographic differencing, we can see how these sinkholes change over the decadal scale. And so these blue examples that shows uplift of the ground surface. And so these were sinkholes that were formed in between the LiDAR acquisitions, and then the red ones are sinkholes that formed between the two LiDAR acquisitions. So with differencing, we can easily measure the sinkhole evolution. So this video is going to show you how you can observe the topographic differencing results from Indiana. So this page is public. It's available at portal.opentopography.org/Indiana. And so can access this page and then look at all of our differencing results. So we have the digital terrain model, the DTM difference, the digital surface model, the DSM difference, and then 2 canopy height models. And so in this video, zooming in real time, looking at the vertical change from about 2011 to 2017 over parts of Indiana. And in this case, I'm zooming into a suburb of Indianapolis. And here we're looking at a set of warehouses, which are blue. So that means that they were constructed between the two LiDAR acquisitions. Now going to then look at the different products, the topographic hillshades. So the two digital surface models, which can give an indication to interpret the differencing results. And then here we're looking at that new housing development. So again, I encourage you to go to this link, portal.opentopography.org/Indiana, to explore the topographic differencing results over the state of Indiana. OpenTopography has built a number of resources so that you can learn more about topographic differencing outside of these webinars. So I encourage you to go to opentopography.org/learn/differencing, and there's a full page on topographic differencing material. So for example, we have a blog post with a variety of differencing examples. There's video tutorials that are posted on YouTube that will walk you through how to do differencing on OpenTopography, like I showed you today. Also to do 3D topographic differencing on MATLAB. We have several conference presentations that have been recorded. We have links to a GitHub code on differencing. So that's differencing similar to what went into the OpenTopography workflow, as well as MATLAB scripts. And then we also have an undergraduate differencing exercise where undergraduate students can use a tool with a user interface to explore and do topographic differencing. And I'll discuss this in more detail in a few weeks during our educational material webinar. And I can go to the next page. There we go. We also have two peer-reviewed open access publications. So one on the left is a Geosphere publication that describes the on-demand topographic differencing tool. So it has some background information for differencing and then walks through the process that we used to develop those vertical and 3D differencing tools. And then we have this publication in remote sensing that describes the statewide differencing for the state of Indiana. So in conclusion, about a third of the lower 48 is covered by repeat LiDAR data. So this presents an enormous opportunity to characterize anthropogenic and natural change. And the tools that OpenTopography has developed, for example, those on-demand differencing tools, and then the statewide differencing of Indiana, can help people to do these differencing calculations. However, going forward becomes a new challenge of how can we analyze these large-scale topographic data sets. For example, it becomes prohibitively time-intensive, and so OpenTopography is looking at approaches like machine learning to figure out how we can analyze these topographic differencing data sets to build on the processing tools that I've explained to you here today. So thank you for coming to this webinar. As always, I invite you to follow OpenTopography on any of our social media resources. And we have about 15 minutes left, so I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Chelsea. That was really nice. Very clear. Emily, Matt, and I answered a few questions that had come up. So I can just summarize. And there was one about OT, about differencing, and if it only works in OpenTopo. And the answers were, we have it set up in OpenTopo, but there is the code that's available on the GitHub repo. Any comments?
The other thing is soon we will open up differencing for the USGS and NOAA data sets to the academic communities, which will vastly increase the number of data sets available for differencing.
Nice. Emily Kleber had a couple of questions about kind of errors and artifacts. And one question was kind of a broad one. How pervasive are georeferencing topographic differencing errors between OpenTopo data sets? So Chris and I tried to answer that, but do you want to comment?
So I think it's a question of scale. So at some level, even small georeferencing errors may add small artifacts to the topographic differencing results. But how these results impact or how these errors impact your results is the real question. So if you're looking at urban growth, building of a new house or apartment complex, the georeferencing errors would have to be truly enormous to impact your results. If you're looking at 10 centimeters of erosion or deposition, then even these small georeferencing errors may impact your results. Generally, these errors also are smaller if you have two newer data sets than if you have either two older data sets or one older data set.
Right, that was good. And then another question. Well, let me just see if there's any new questions.
No new questions.
All right, another one from Emily was, do point cloud artifacts like corduroy or tile boundaries show up in the differencing? Are they easy to see? And so Matt pointed out especially that you can see them quite nicely in that Indiana data set, but it's again kind of data set dependent and so forth. So I don't know if you wanted to comment there.
It's just another point of smaller scale differences are always going to be harder to resolve. And any errors that you have are going to impact your data much more. And in Indiana, it's the earlier data set that was acquired between 2011 to 2013 that adds the largest flight alignment errors. And we know that because those stripes at the statewide scale, stripes of the errors, the statewide scale correlate very well with the boundaries of that first data set acquisition. So again, depends on the scale that you're interested in observing and the quality of your original data sets.
Okay, well, we got a question here. This is so cool to have tools available and accessible to everyone, and the scale of differencing of Indiana is amazing. Paul's curious about the challenges of differencing from different sources, such as SFM versus LiDAR in terms of 3D and the DEM approaches. What are the main challenges that arise? Any way those can be mitigated?
Yes, that's a good question. So, at least at first, two primary challenges come to mind. First is that the LiDAR and LiDAR and structure from motion data sets often have very different resolutions. So LiDAR can be on the order of like 1 point per meter squared, and SFM on the order of 200 points per meter squared. So it's about 2 orders of magnitude difference. So in this case, what I've typically done is undersample the structure from motion point cloud data set to be much closer, but often still a higher resolution than the LiDAR point cloud. And I found that generally you don't need all those points to do the differencing, and it makes the computation much longer. And then the second challenge is that those two data sets often have a different sensitivity to vegetation. And so what I've worked to do is to perform ground classifications on both data sets and to remove the vegetation at least as best I can. And so, for example, I've used last tools for that ground classification and worked fairly diligently to explore what parameters for the ground classification removed the vegetation in the best way.
Yeah, and I should note that you have a paper on that. That's your Dry Lake Valley paper, which I'm trying to paste in here for everyone. Just DOI for that.
Thank you.
Other questions? Let me see here. Open. Couple more minutes. I wanted to ask a question maybe of interest to people is one thing about the vertical differencing that people have done a lot for geomorphic questions is volume and maybe other things, but volume calculations. So can you talk a little bit about how that works and how we deal with kind of error propagation? So we have uncertainty in 2 digital elevation models, and then how do we take that into error for a volume estimate?
Yeah, so the sort of next part of the differencing that I didn't talk about today is doing calculations of volumetric change. So for example, you're interested in knowing what the volume of a cliff that eroded was, or how much material was lost along a stream bank of a river. And so Ramon's question is, how do you deal with errors in that calculation? And so one approach is to do thresholding, which I briefly discussed here, and that's where you remove individual displacements that are below the error threshold. And so if your error is 0.5 meter, you would remove any displacement that was 0.5 meter or less. So for example, 30 centimeters. And this approach can be quite helpful, especially visually, to focus someone's attention on the displacements that are real, so bigger than the likely error. The other approach is to do an error propagation. And so in the volumetric calculation, in this case, you wouldn't just remove points that have too high of an error, but you would do a more formal propagation of the uncertainty. And in this case, the focus shifts from looking at the error in individual points to the average error in the full point cloud results.
Very good. Thank you. Oh, let me see here. What do we got? Okay. Anyone else? Questions? I guess one last one, just do you want to talk briefly about other differencing methods like image correlation and how that might compare with like the 3D differencing that you've really advanced?
Yeah, so there are multiple other examples of calculating landscape change. Another approach, as Ramon mentioned, is image correlation. And in this case, people base their calculations largely off of images, for example, acquired before and after an earthquake. And they use those images to calculate motion of the land surface. And in some ways, this method is very complementary to the 3D topographic change, as both results can get 3D differencing results. However, with the differencing, we are using the elevation to align the data sets instead of the color in the images.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from the panelists or from participants?
Yeah, I just put the Chelsea mentioned this page in her talk, but this is like if you're looking for more information on differencing in general, whether that's OpenTopos tools or other sort of guidance on how to do differencing, there's a lot of information on that page. That's definitely something to check out. There's like some interesting talks from a workshop we ran in 2018, including a talk about kind of optical based change. That talk by Craig Glennie on PID is an interesting one if you're interested in that. So that's just pointing out that's a resource that there's a lot of great content on. And we add things to it so you can come back to it occasionally and check it out.
All right, thank you everyone. And please come next week where we'll hear about hydrology and topography using OpenTopography's tools. And Emily Zawacki will give us that presentation.